They told you this was about national security. Sure. And fast food is about nutrition. What's actually happening is simpler and uglier. This is a stress test, not of Trump, not of Democrats, not of cable news, of the system. Because for the first time in this second term, the pushback is not coming from the opposition. It's coming from inside the building, from Republicans, quietly, procedurally, with the kind of votes that don't trend until they blow up. And here's the part most people miss. This isn't one story. It's one pattern wearing different costumes. War powers, emergency powers, allies treated like negotiable property, and Congress trying, late, nervous, imperfect, to remind the White House that the presidency is a job, not a personal franchise. Let's walk through the timeline, because the timeline is where the truth hides. Start with January, early January. A U.S. operation in Venezuela ends with Nicolas Maduro in U.S. custody. The administration describes it like a law enforcement operation, with the military in support. Not a war, not an invasion, just a very loud arrest. That framing matters, because law enforcement sounds clean, war sounds expensive, and it buys time. Time to set the narrative. Time to avoid the one sentence presidents hate. Congress didn't authorize this. Now watch what happens next, not on TV, on paper. January 8th. The Senate votes 52-47 to force the question onto the floor under the War Powers Resolution. A procedural move, not the final vote. But it's the door opening. And 5 Republicans join Democrats to open that door. That is the quiet revolt. Not a speech, not a rally, a vote. Because war powers isn't sexy. It's a lever, and someone just pulled it. Why would Republicans do that? Because they know something the internet forgets every election cycle. If you normalize unilateral force under your guy, you inherit it under the next guy. Precedent is a boomerang. It always comes back. It just doesn't ask who you voted for. So the Senate cracks the door. Then the White House does what the White House always does when it feels a leash. It fights the leash. Pressure starts. Phone calls, warnings, promises, threats. And then, this is the key. The Senate doesn't kill the resolution head on. It kills it sideways. A point of order, a procedural blade. The vote ties, and the vice president breaks it, 51-50. The war powers track is dismissed. The rebellion is contained, not defeated. Contained. That's not just politics. That's panic management. Because if war powers takes oxygen, everything else looks like what it is. A president expanding options first and asking permission later. Now jump to the House. January 22nd. Same idea. Different chamber. A war powers resolution to limit military action in Venezuela. It fails 215-215. A tie. They hold the vote open. A Republican member rushes back to cast the deciding vote. And that tells you the real story. This wasn't a comfortable win. It was a scramble. The system didn't slam the brakes, but it did tap them, hard enough to make noise. So here's the first takeaway. In 2026 America, the real battles aren't always on camera. They're in roll calls, points of order, discharge motions, and 3 a.m. phone calls. If you want to know where the country is going, stop watching the speeches. Start watching the procedure. Now, while all of this is happening, Trump is running a second track, a separate track, but it's the same pattern. Greenland. Yes, Greenland. If you laughed, you're behind. Because the President of the United States has said the U.S. needs to own Greenland. Not cooperate, not partner. Own. And he doesn't say it like a professor, he says it like a landlord. The argument is always the same. Russia, China, security. But listen closely to the logic. We have to have it, or someone else will. That's not a treaty argument. That's a possession argument. And here's why it matters. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. Denmark is a NATO ally, meaning NATO's core principle, collective defense, gets weird, fast. If the United States starts talking like an adversary to a NATO member, you don't need a PhD for this. You need one sentence. If you threaten an ally's territory, you are not strengthening the alliance. You are testing whether the alliance is real. Now, Europeans didn't treat this as a joke. They treated it as a fire alarm. There were statements. There was diplomatic pushback. France and Canada opened consulates in Nuuk, Greenland's capital. signaling that the island is not a blank space on a map. It's a place with sovereignty sensitivity. And the world is planting flags, political flags, not military ones. And NATO? NATO starts discussing a mission concept aimed at Arctic security, a way to reassure Trump that allies are stepping up without handing over the deed. That mission even gets a name floating around: Arctic Sentry. Notice what's happening? Trump creates pressure with maximalist language. Allies respond with institution language. Congress responds with resolution language. And the public gets fed headline language. Different languages. Same collision. Now here's the part you weren't shown. Greenland isn't only about Greenland. It's about a new negotiating style. Treat allies like counterparties. Treat treaties like suggestions. Treat territory like a bargaining chip. And if they resist, raise the cost. The UK Parliament's own research brief lays it out bluntly. The US threatening tariffs on Denmark and other European countries in connection with Greenland talks, then dialing it back after conversations with NATO leadership. So ask yourself, what kind of security strategy begins with a tariff threat? That's not defense, that's leverage. Which brings us to the third track, the most important track, the one people ignore because it's written in legalese. Emergency powers. January 9th. The White House issues an executive order declaring a national emergency tied to Venezuelan oil revenues held in U.S. Treasury accounts. Read that again. A national emergency. About funds, in accounts, under U.S. custody. This is where the story turns from loud to dangerous, not because the order is automatically illegal, but because of what it signals. When political friction rises, the presidency reaches for emergency, because emergency changes the rules. Emergency centralizes decisions. Emergency frames dissent as sabotage. And emergency is addictive. The order cites authorities like the National Emergencies Act and IEPA. It uses the language presidents love: unusual and extraordinary threat. That phrase is a key. It unlocks a whole hallway of executive discretion. And this is the broader pattern: war language, emergency language, ownership language. All of it does the same thing. It moves decision-making away from debate and into the hands of one office. Now, here's where Republicans come back in. Because the Republican pushback you saw, war powers votes, wasn't about loving Democrats. It was about fearing the precedent. But even inside the GOP, you can see the split. Some Republicans supported the initial operation against Maduro, and then drew a line at long-term involvement without authorization. That's not ideological. That's institutional self-preservation, because voters don't read the War Powers Act, but they do understand the word war, and they understand the word draft, and they understand the word cost, and they really understand the word ally. A conflict with Venezuela is one thing. A public threat toward NATO territory is another. And when those two sit in the same month, lawmakers start imagining hearings that end careers, so they try to pull a lever. Not because they became saints, because they became nervous. Now, let's connect the dots. The headlines keep separate. Dot 1. Military action framed as not a war. Dot 2. Congress tries to reassert war powers. Twice. Senate and House. Both times. It almost sticks. Dot 3. Greenland rhetoric escalates into, we need to own it, with allies bristling, NATO planning, and new consulates opening. Dot 4. A national emergency declaration tied to Venezuelan oil funds. Same month, same administration, same core theme. Power expands fastest when the public is overwhelmed. That's the real tactic. Not a conspiracy, a method. Flood the zone. Make everything urgent. Make everything existential. Make every check on power sound like betrayal. And while everyone argues about the latest sentence, the machinery moves. Because democracy doesn't usually die with a coup. It erodes with paperwork. Now, you might ask, so what's the anatomy here? What's the hidden structure? 3 parts. 1. The ownership worldview. Trump talks about Greenland like a property deal. He talks about security like possession. He talks about alliances like transactions. That worldview clashes with the post-1945 order the U.S. helped build. Treaties, mutual defense, sovereignty norms. If you treat that order like a menu, you shouldn't be surprised when other countries stop trusting the kitchen. 2. The emergency reflex. When a president declares emergencies to manage complex political problems, it's not just policy, it's governance style. And once you normalize that style, the question becomes, what doesn't qualify as an emergency? If oil funds qualify, if migration qualifies, if malign actors qualify, then anything qualifies, which means nothing restrains. 3. The procedural rebellion. This is the quiet revolution, not in the streets, in the Senate clerk's office. Because the guardrails in America are not emotional. They're procedural, they're boring on purpose, they're slow on purpose, and that slowness is what stops impulse from becoming doctrine, but only if people use it. And that's why Republican votes on war powers matter, even when they lose, especially when they lose narrowly. Because close votes reveal fear, and fear reveals fractures, and fractures reveal where the next fight will happen. Now let's get practical. If you want to know where this goes next, watch 3 signals. Signal 1. Does the White House keep using emergency language for non-emergency governance? Because that tells you the administration prefers shortcuts to persuasion. Signal 2. Do more Republicans vote for procedural checks, even if leadership tries to bury them? Because that tells you the internal coalition is weakening. Signal 3. Do allies begin building parallel structures, consulates, missions, joint statements, specifically to handle the U.S.? Because that tells you trust is falling. And trust is the real currency of power. Not slogans, not speeches. Trust. Now, the ending. People will tell you this is just another Trump storm, another headline, another week. Wrong. This is how power changes shape. Not with one dramatic event, but with repeated tests. Can the executive act first and ask later? Can Congress stop it? Can allies resist without splitting the alliance? Can institutions stay functional when the pressure comes from the top? Those questions are bigger than Trump. And that's why this matters. Because whatever precedent is set in 2026 will still exist in 2036. And the people who inherit it won't ask permission to use it. So when you see Republicans quietly push back, don't mistake it for virtue. It's something more revealing. It's the sound of the system realizing it might not be able to absorb another emergency as routine, another deal as foreign policy, another operation as war. And when the system realizes that, it either tightens the guardrails or it gives up pretending they exist. That's the real story. Not who said what on social media, who still has the power to say no, and whether no still means anything. In the next episode, we'll go deeper into Greenland, why tariffs were even on the table, why NATO is floating new Arctic missions, and why security is becoming a cover word for something else. Because the news you saw was the headline. What you didn't see was the mechanism. And this channel is about mechanisms.